The cowboy waited for a mail-order bride, but identical twins stepped off the wagon. I only sent funds for one. The dust, red and fine as milled flour, settled on the shoulders of the two women. They stood perfectly still, their faces pale maps of exhaustion under the unblinking Wyoming sun. One held the hand of a small, silent boy who hid behind the folds of her skirt. The other, the one who had written the letters, stepped forward. Her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white stones. "Please, sir, Mr. Colton, I am Alara Vance. This is my sister, Maeve, and her son, Finn. We had nowhere else to go." Silas Colton said nothing. He looked from one face to the other, a perfect, startling mirror. Same dark hair pulled into a severe bun, same wide-set eyes the color of a stormy sky, same faint dusting of freckles across the bridge of the nose. But where Alara's gaze was fraught with a pleading anxiety, her sister's was a study in weary defense. Maeve's eyes were fixed on him, alert and cautious, her body a silent shield for the child. The stage driver, impatient to be on his way, tossed a single battered trunk into the dirt with a thud that sent up another puff of red. He tipped his hat curtly and climbed back onto his seat, the crack of his whip a final, sharp punctuation to the women's arrival. They were here. They were his problem now. The silence that followed was immense, filled only by the ceaseless whisper of the wind across the plains. It was a silence Silas knew well. It was the language of his life. He lived in it, worked in it, slept in it. But this silence was different. It was heavy with unspoken history and desperate hope. He had paid for a wife, a helper, a presence to fill the hollow ache of his cabin. He had prepared for one woman. He had braced himself for the awkwardness of a stranger in his home, the slow, careful building of a life from practicality. He had not prepared for this. He had not prepared for a family. He saw the townsfolk 100 yards away, by the mercantile, their figures wavering in the heat. They were watching, their curiosity a palpable thing. He could see the judgment already forming in their minds. His gaze fell on the boy, Finn. The child's face was smudged with dirt, his small frame thin beneath a threadbare shirt. He did not cry or fidget. He just watched Silas with an old man's solemnity. In the boy's stillness, Silas felt a faint, painful echo of a memory he kept buried deep. A small hand in his, a different kind of silence, the kind that comes after. He made a decision, not with his mind, but with some deeper, more weathered part of himself. He reached down and lifted the trunk, the leather handle creaking under the strain. He hoisted it onto the back of his buckboard wagon without a word. He looked at the women, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat brim. "Get in," he did not help them up. He turned and climbed onto the driver's seat, his movements stiff and deliberate. He waited. He heard the rustle of skirts, the soft scrape of a boot on the wagon bed, the quiet lift as one woman helped the other. They settled behind him, a huddled knot of uncertainty. He clucked to the horses. The wagon lurched forward, leaving the dusty outpost behind. The journey toward redemption had begun, though no one, least of all Silas, would have called it by that name. The ride to his homestead was a long, wordless affair. The landscape stretched out in every direction, a vast, indifferent canvas of sagebrush and rock under a sky so big it seemed to press down on the earth. The sun beat on the back of Silas's neck. He could feel the women's presence behind him, a weight both physical and emotional. He imagined their thoughts, their fears. They had traveled more than 1,000 miles on the promise of a stranger, a man who now knew they had deceived him. He kept his eyes on the familiar ruts of the trail, his jaw set. He was a man of his word. He had agreed to a wife. He had not agreed to a lie, to a sister and a child who were not part of the bargain. Yet he had not left them at the depot. He could have. He could have given the stage driver another $1 to take them back east on the next run. No one would have blamed him, but he had looked at the boy, and the choice had been taken from him. They arrived as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The cabin was small, built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a single window that stared out at the emptiness like a lonely eye. A barn stood some 50 yards away, its wood weathered to a silver gray. It was a place of solitude, built for one. The silence here was deeper, broken only by the lowing of his few cattle and the cry of a hawk circling overhead. He pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. For a long moment he just stood there, looking at the home that had been his refuge from the world, knowing it was about to be breached. He turned to the women. "The cabin is yours," his voice was rough and used to conversation. "I'll sleep in the barn. There's stew on the stove. Firewood in the box." He unhitched the horses, his movements efficient and practiced, a way of avoiding their eyes, their inevitable questions. He led the animals toward the barn, the jingle of their harnesses a lonely sound in the twilight. He did not look back. Inside the cabin, Maeve and Alara stood in the center of the single room, their shadows long and flickering in the fading light. It was sparse, but clean. A sturdy table with 2 chairs. A stone hearth, the embers of a morning fire still glowing faintly. A bed frame in the corner, covered with a simple wool blanket. And against the far wall, a small, wooden rocking chair, its arms worn smooth with use. It seemed out of place, a relic of a softer life. Maeve ran a hand over its back, the wood cool beneath her touch. Finn, finally releasing his grip on her skirt, walked slowly toward the hearth, drawn by its residual warmth. He sat on the floor and stared into the glowing coals, his small face illuminated. Alara wrung her hands, her voice a strained whisper. "He will send us away in the morning." "Perhaps," Maeve said, her gaze sweeping the room, taking in every detail. She walked to the stove and lifted the lid of the pot. The smell of beef and root vegetables filled the small space. It was the smell of sustenance, of life. She found 3 tin plates and 3 spoons in a wooden crate nailed to the wall. She ladled the stew onto the plates, her movements calm and methodical. "But tonight we eat." She handed a plate to her sister, then crouched down and offered one to her son. Finn looked up at her, his eyes wide, and then began to eat, slowly at first, then with a quiet, desperate hunger. The sisters ate standing up, their eyes meeting over the boy's head. They had survived another day. They had found shelter. For now it was enough. Maeve looked toward the closed cabin door, behind which the vast, dark plains stretched into nothingness. She felt the presence of the silent man in the barn, a looming question mark over their future. She was exhausted, but she was not broken. She had her son. She had her sister. She would face the morning when it came. The morning came, and the man did not send them away. A new routine, unspoken and fragile, began to form. Before the sun crested the horizon, Silas would leave the barn. He would draw a fresh bucket of water from the well and leave it on the cabin's porch steps. Beside it, he would place a small stack of firewood, split and ready for the stove. Then he would turn to his work, disappearing into the vastness of his land to mend fences, tend his small herd of cattle, or clear stubborn rocks from a patch of ground he hoped might one day become a field. He worked from dawn until dusk, a solitary figure moving against the immense backdrop of the plains. He did not speak to them. He did not approach the cabin again until night had fully fallen, and the single lamp in the window was extinguished. Inside the cabin, the sisters created their own rhythm. They rose with the first light, using the water and wood the silent man provided. They kept the cabin immaculate, scrubbing the floorboards, washing the single window until it gleamed, and airing out the blankets in the sharp, clean wind. Maeve, practical and resourceful, found his mending basket. His shirts were worn, the elbows thin, the cuffs frayed. She sat for hours in the afternoon light, her needle moving with a steady, practiced rhythm, reinforcing seams and patching holes with scraps of cloth she found in their trunk. She was repaying a debt, stitch by stitch. Alara, whose hands were less suited to a needle, took charge of the cooking. She was inventive with their meager supplies, making the stews and salted meat last, baking a dense, hearty bread in the small cast-iron oven. She tried, with little success, to coax a few hardy greens from the stubborn soil in a small patch behind the cabin. The boy, Finn, was the quiet center of their new world. For the first few days, he did not stray from the cabin door. He played with stones, arranging them in silent, intricate patterns in the dirt. But slowly, the vastness of the place began to call to him. He started to venture further, exploring the area around the cabin. His small figure a stark contrast to the endless land. He never went near the barn. It was the man's place, and the man was a source of deep, childish suspicion. One afternoon, Silas was returning from the far pasture when he saw the boy. Finn was crouched by the woodpile, his attention fixed on a small, crudely carved object. Silas stopped, staying in the shadow of the barn. He had left it there that morning. A small bird, whittled from a piece of scrap pine. He wasn't sure why he'd done it. He just had. He watched as Finn picked it up, his small fingers tracing the rough shape of the wings. The boy did not smile, but he held the wooden bird with a kind of reverence, clutching it to his chest before scurrying back to the safety of the cabin porch. Silas felt a strange, unfamiliar tightening in his own chest. He turned and went back into the barn, his solitude feeling, for the first time in a long time, less like a comfort and more like a cage. The days bled into weeks. The silence between the cabin and the barn remained, but its quality began to change. It was no longer the tense, brittle silence of strangers. It was becoming a silence of shared space, of mutual unspoken understanding. Work was the language they all understood. He provided. They maintained. It was a simple, stark economy of survival. Yet, within this framework, small, almost imperceptible shifts were occurring. One evening, returning to the barn later than usual, Silas saw that the porch step where he left the water and wood was no longer empty. A plate, covered with a clean cloth, sat waiting for him. Beneath the cloth was a thick slice of bread and a piece of roasted meat. Beside it, one of his work shirts, the elbow patched with a neat, almost invisible square of dark fabric, was folded cleanly. He stood there for a long moment, the plate in one hand, the shirt in the other. He ate the food standing in the deepening twilight, the taste of it somehow different from the meals he made for himself. Tasted of care. He took the shirt into the barn and, in the dim light of his lantern, examined the stitches. They were small and perfect. A woman's work, a mother's work. He began leaving things for them in return. Not just the whittled toys for the boy, which now included a horse and a clumsy-looking cow, but other things. A handful of wild berries he found growing by the creek. A string of fish he caught. A piece of honeycomb, dripping with golden sweetness, that he'd cut from a bee tree. He never presented these gifts directly. He simply left them on the porch with the morning wood, a silent offering. And in the evenings, his meal would be waiting. It was a conversation conducted through objects, a cautious exchange across the 50 yards of packed earth that separated their worlds. He found himself watching them more, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, guarded curiosity. He watched Maeve as she hung laundry on a line she had fashioned between two posts, the wind whipping her skirts around her ankles, her movements strong and sure. He saw the way she spoke to Finn, her voice low and gentle, a stark contrast to the harshness of their surroundings. He watched Alara as she knelt in her small, stubborn garden, her brow furrowed in concentration, her determination a fragile but fierce thing. He saw two women who were not just surviving, but were actively trying to build a life out of the dust and silence he had offered them. One afternoon, a sharp, cold wind began to blow from the north, carrying the scent of rain and something more. The sky, which had been a clear, brilliant blue, began to fill with bruised-looking clouds that scudded across the plains. Silas knew this wind. It was the harbinger of a sudden, violent turn in the weather. He finished securing the cattle in their lean-to and turned his attention to the cabin. The latch on the main door had always been loose. He'd meant to fix it for a year. The wind was already rattling it in its frame. He grabbed his tools and walked toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the dry ground. It was the first time he had approached it during daylight since their arrival. He did not knock. He simply set his tools down on the porch and began to work, his movements economical and precise. He could hear their silence from inside. The soft murmur of voices had stopped. He could feel their eyes on him through the window. He ignored it, focusing on the task, on the solid feel of the hammer in his hand, the bite of the screw into the wood. He replaced the old, worn latch with a new, sturdy iron one he had forged himself months ago. He tested it. It closed with a satisfying, solid click. He gathered his tools and walked away, back to the safety of his barn. He did not see Maeve open the door a crack and watch him go, her hand resting on the new, strong latch. He did not see the look on her face, a complex mixture of gratitude and confusion. The storm was coming. But inside the cabin, for the first time, they felt a little more secure against it. The storm broke that night, a furious onslaught of wind and freezing rain that turned the world outside the cabin into a maelstrom of noise and darkness. The wind howled like a hungry animal, clawing at the log walls and rattling the newly fixed latch. Inside, the three of them huddled close to the fire, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Alara was visibly terrified, jumping at every loud gust. Maeve held Finn close, humming a low, tuneless song to soothe him, her own body tense. It was in the deepest part of the night that Finn began to cough. At first, it was a small, dry sound, but it quickly deepened into a harsh, ragged bark that shook his small frame. Maeve touched his forehead. It was burning with fever. She laid him on the bed, her heart a cold knot of fear in her chest. She bathed his face with a cool, damp cloth, but the fever only seemed to climb. He grew listless, his breathing shallow and quick. Alara began to weep silently in the corner, her fear a useless, paralyzing thing. Maeve felt a wave of desperate, terrifying isolation. They were alone, miles from any town, with a sick child and a storm raging outside. They had no medicine, no knowledge of what to do. Just as her hope began to fray completely, the cabin door was flung open. Silas stood there, framed against the raging storm, snow and ice clinging to his coat and hat. He looked like a creature born of the tempest itself. He took in the scene in a single sweeping glance, the weeping sister, the terrified mother, the sick child in the bed. He did not hesitate. He shut the door behind him, the solid click of the latch a sound of finality, and strode into the room. He shed his heavy coat, revealing the dry clothes beneath. He went to the bed and placed a large, rough hand on Finn's forehead. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "Fever," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. He turned to Maeve. "Willow bark. In the tin by the hearth. Make a tea." Strong, his words were commands, but they were not unkind. They were the words of a man taking charge. Maeve, startled out of her panicked inertia, moved to do as he said, her hands fumbling with the tin. He then took the cloth from her, dipped it in the cool water bucket, and began to bathe the boy's face and neck with slow, methodical movements. He worked in silence, his focus entirely on the child. The air in the room shifted. The raw panic receded, replaced by a tense, focused energy. He was no longer the stranger from the barn. He was a force against the storm, both outside and within the boy. He worked through the night. He brewed the bitter tea and coaxed small sips of it into Finn. When the boy grew restless and began to cry, a weak, piteous sound, Silas did something that stunned both women into silence. He lifted Finn from the bed, wrapping him in a wool blanket, and sat down in the small wooden rocking chair. He cradled the boy against his broad chest and began to rock, a slow, steady, rhythmic motion. The creak of the chair was a soft, comforting sound against the fury of the wind. He did not speak. He just rocked, his large body a bastion of warmth and strength, his gaze fixed on the fire. Maeve sank onto the floor near the hearth, watching him. The suspicion she had held onto for weeks finally dissolved, washed away by the raw, undeniable sight of this silent, solitary man tending to her son with a tenderness she could not have imagined. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the deep-carved grief in the set of his jaw. In that moment, she saw not just the man who had given them shelter, but the man he was and perhaps the man he had been before sorrow had hollowed him out. She watched him rock her child, and for the first time since they had stepped off that wagon, she felt the fragile, tentative beginnings of trust. As dawn broke, the storm broke with it. The wind died down to a low moan, and the freezing rain turned to a soft, quiet snow. The world outside was blanketed in a pristine, silent white. Inside the cabin, another, more important storm had passed. Finn's fever had broken. He slept peacefully in Silas's arms, his breathing deep and even, his forehead cool to the touch. Silas had not moved from the rocking chair all night. He looked bone-weary, but his expression was calm. He looked over at Maeve, who had dozed fitfully by the fire. Their eyes met in the gray morning light. The silence that passed between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the shared ordeal of the night, with gratitude, with a new and profound understanding. He gently placed the sleeping boy back in the bed, tucking the blanket around him. He stood up, his joints stiff, and walked to the hearth to add another log to the fire. The flames licked at the fresh wood, and a comfortable warmth began to fill the room once more. Maeve rose and went to the stove. She put a pot of coffee on to boil, the familiar, domestic act, a way of grounding herself in this new reality. She felt a need to speak, to fill the quiet with words, to acknowledge what had happened. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. The words felt inadequate, small against the magnitude of what he had done. Silas merely nodded, his back still to her as he poked at the fire. He seemed uncomfortable with her gratitude, as if it were a coat that did not fit. Maeve persisted, driven by a need to make him understand. "We had nowhere else. My sister," she answered, "your advertisement as a way out. For all of us. The man we worked for back in Ohio, a Mr. Sterling, he was not a kind man. We were indentured. My husband had died, and I had no way to pay our passage. Sterling owned our labor and he owned our time. He saw us as little more than property. When Alara saw your letter in the paper, it was like a prayer being answered. But she could not leave me. She could not leave Finn. So we took what little money we had saved and bought 3 tickets instead of 1. We hoped you would have mercy." She stopped, her confession hanging in the quiet air. She had laid their desperation bare. Silas turned slowly from the fire. He looked at her, his eyes holding a deep, ancient sadness. He walked over to the rocking chair and ran a hand along its worn arm, the gesture full of a private, sorrowful weight. "I had a son," he said, his voice thick with disuse and memory. "His name was Daniel, and a wife, Sarah." He paused, the names themselves seeming to cause him a physical pain. "Lost them both to the fever, 4 winters ago." In this room he looked around the small cabin, and for the first time, Maeve saw it not as a bachelor's sparse dwelling, but as a place haunted by ghosts, a shrine to a life that had been brutally erased. The rocker was his. The silence that followed was one of shared grief. Maeve finally understood the hollow spaces in this man, the reason for his solitary existence. He was not just a recluse. He was a man in mourning, a man who had walled himself off from a world that had taken everything from him. And last night, in this very room, he had fought to keep that same world from taking her son. The 50 yards between the cabin and the barn suddenly seemed to have vanished completely. They were no longer a stranger and his inconvenient dependence. They were 2 people who understood the fragility of life, the deep, abiding pain of loss. He had saved her son. And in doing so, he had perhaps, without knowing it, taken the first step towards saving himself. The coffee began to boil, its rich aroma filling the air, a scent of morning, of normalcy, of a day beginning not in fear, but in quiet, solemn grace. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The deep snows of the blizzard melted under the strengthening spring sun, revealing a land washed clean, ready for new growth. The arrangement in the cabin shifted. Silas did not return to the barn. He took a corner of the main room for his own, laying his bedroll near the hearth, a quiet but significant claim on the space. The cabin, once a place of tense, separate orbits, became a shared home. The routines continued, but they were different now, interwoven. They often ate their meals together at the small table, the silence now comfortable, punctuated by the small sounds of life. The clink of a spoon against a plate, Finn's soft chatter about a frog he'd seen by the creek, the crackle of the fire. The stories of their pasts, once locked away, began to surface in small, fragmented pieces. Maeve spoke of her late husband, a kind man with a laugh that could fill a room, taken by an accident at the mill. Silas, in turn, shared a memory of Sarah, of the way she would hum while she baked, of the wildflower seeds she had tried to plant near the porch. He spoke of Daniel, a boy who had loved to fish and who had believed he could talk to horses. They were not conversations, so much as offerings. Small, precious relics of memory lay gently between them in the quiet evenings. He learned that Alara, for all her anxiety, possessed a surprising wit, and that Maeve's quiet exterior hid a fierce, unyielding well of resilience. They, in turn, discovered that beneath his stoicism, Silas had a dry sense of humor that appeared in rare, unexpected flashes, and a deep, abiding patience, especially with Finn. The boy, now fully recovered and thriving, became the bridge that spanned the remaining distance between them. He followed Silas everywhere, a small, chattering shadow. He would help mend fences by handing Silas the wrong tool with grave importance. He would sit on the top rail of the corral, offering a running commentary as Silas worked with the horses. Silas, who had not truly spoken to a child in 4 years, found himself answering Finn's endless questions, pointing out the names of birds, showing him how to track a rabbit. He carved the boy a whole family of wooden animals, each one more detailed than the last. In the child's uncomplicated affection, Silas felt a warmth seeping back into the frozen corners of his heart. He was beginning to remember what it felt like to be part of a family. But their fragile peace was built on a precarious foundation. They needed supplies: flour, salt, coffee, new boots for Finn. The trip to town could no longer be avoided. The thought of it filled all 3 adults with a quiet dread. Town meant people. It meant questions. It meant facing the world that they had so far managed to keep at bay. One bright May morning, they hitched the buckboard and, for the first time, rode into the settlement together. Silas sat on the driver's seat, with Maeve beside him, holding a scrubbed-clean Finn on her lap. Alara sat in the back, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. They looked, for all the world, like a family. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. The town of Redemption was little more than a single dusty street lined with a handful of wooden buildings. As they pulled up to the mercantile, Silas saw the familiar faces turn toward them. He saw the flicker of curiosity in their eyes, the whispers that started behind cupped hands. He had been a solitary figure for so long that the sight of him with 2 women and a child was an event worthy of speculation. He helped Maeve down from the wagon, his hand briefly covering hers. The touch was brief, practical, but it sent a jolt through both of them. They had just stepped onto the boardwalk when a voice, sharp and cruel, cut through the air. "Well, well, look what the wind blew in. Thieves and runaways." Maeve froze, her blood turning to ice. She knew that voice. She turned slowly. There, standing in front of the saloon, was Mr. Sterling. He was just as she remembered. A portly man in a too-tight city suit, his face florid, his eyes small and mean. He was not supposed to be here. He was a creature of her past, a ghost she thought she had left 1,000 miles behind. He sneered, his gaze sweeping over them with contempt. "I should have known you'd run to the farthest, most godforsaken corner of the earth. Did you really think you could steal from me and get away with it? You, Alara, breaking your contract. And you, Maeve, absconding with my property." He pointed a thick finger at Finn. "That boy's labor belongs to me until your debt is paid." The street went quiet. The townsfolk stopped their conversations, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. This was better than gossip. It was a public spectacle. Alara shrank back, her face ashen. Maeve's first instinct was to pull Finn behind her, to shield him with her body. She stood her ground, her chin high, but her heart hammered against her ribs. Sterling took a step forward. "I've come to collect what's mine." Before he could take another, Silas moved. He stepped in front of Maeve, placing himself squarely between her and Sterling. He was taller than Sterling, broader, and where Sterling was soft and pampered, Silas was hard lines and weathered strength. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. His presence was enough. "You're mistaken," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "There are no runaways here." Sterling scoffed. "I have papers. Contract. This woman and her child are indentured to me." Silas's gaze did not waver. It was as cold and hard as granite. He reached back, not looking, and his hand found Maeve's. He drew her forward to stand beside him, his arms settling protectively around her shoulders. He looked directly at Sterling, but his words were for the entire town to hear, a clear and undeniable declaration. "They are with me now. This is their home." He looked down at Maeve, his expression softening for a fraction of a second, before turning his steel-like gaze back to Sterling. "Her name is Maeve Colton. And this," he said, nodding toward the boy who was now clinging to his leg, "is my son." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. It was a lie, a bold and stunning one, but it was delivered with such conviction, such absolute certainty, that it had the unshakable ring of truth. He had given them his name. He had claimed them as his own in front of the whole world. Sterling's face went from red to purple. He was a bully, accustomed to intimidating the weak and defenseless. He was not prepared for a quiet, resolute man standing on his own ground, defending his own family. He sputtered, opened and closed his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at the faces of the townsfolk, who were now staring at him not with curiosity, but with a clear, cold judgment. He looked at Silas's unwavering eyes and the protective arm wrapped around the woman. Defeated, humiliated. He turned without another word and stomped back into the saloon. The confrontation was over. The ride back to the homestead was as silent as the first one had been, but it was a silence of a different universe. The air in the wagon was charged with the enormity of what had just happened. Maeve sat beside Silas, acutely aware of the space between them, a space that now felt both smaller and infinitely more complex. He had lied for them. He had publicly declared her his wife and Finn his son. He had shielded them with his name, a name that carried weight in this small community, the name of a man who kept to himself but was known to be honest and steadfast. It was an act of profound, startling redemption, a public claiming that severed the last ties to the miserable life they had fled. When they reached the cabin, the place looked different. The afternoon sun caught the window, making it shine like a beacon. It was no longer just a shelter he had offered them. It was the home he had declared it to be. He unhitched the horses, his movements as deliberate as ever, but Maeve saw the tension in his shoulders. He had risked his reputation, his quiet, ordered life, for them. As he led the horses to the barn, Finn ran after him, grabbing his hand. Silas stopped and looked down at the boy. He hesitated for only a second before his large hand closed around Finn's small one. Together, man and boy walked toward the barn. Maeve watched them go, a lump forming in her throat. The next morning, a new sound filled the air, the rhythmic, solid thud of a hammer. Silas was outside, behind the cabin, measuring out a plot of ground. He had a stack of fresh-cut lumber, hauled from the small mill up in the hills. He was building. Without discussion, without a formal agreement, he was adding a room to the cabin. The sound of his hammer was a promise, a tangible manifestation of the declaration he had made in town. It was the sound of a future being built, nail by nail. The dynamic of their lives shifted again, settling into a new, more permanent shape. Alara, freed from the shadow of Sterling, seemed to find a lighter version of herself. She began to accompany Silas and Maeve on their now regular trips to town. It was there she met the blacksmith, a kind, steady widower named Thomas who was immediately taken with her quiet charm. A gentle, proper courtship began, with Silas's quiet, approving presence acting as a sort of paternal blessing. The original purpose of their journey, for Alara to be a bride, was transforming into something truer, something not born of desperation but of genuine affection. But the heart of the homestead was the quiet, deepening bond between Silas and Maeve. They worked together now, a seamless team. She helped him in the garden, which, under their combined efforts, was finally beginning to thrive. He helped her with the heavier chores around the cabin. They moved around each other with an easy, familiar grace. Their long silences no longer a void to be filled, but a shared space of comfortable companionship. The addition to the cabin took shape, a new room that would be for the sisters, giving them privacy and space. It was a physical testament to his commitment. Finn was the joyful, exuberant link between them all. He would sit on a pile of lumber, supervising Silas, handing him nails, his pockets full of the wooden animals Silas had carved. One afternoon, he came into the cabin and presented Silas with a piece of paper on which he had drawn a picture in charcoal from the fire. It was a wobbly, charming drawing of a square house with a tall man, 2 women, and a small boy standing in front of it, all of them holding hands. Silas took the drawing and, without a word, tacked it to the wall beside the hearth. It became the first true decoration the cabin had ever had. The summer was long and warm, a season of quiet growth. The corn in the garden grew tall, and the small herd of cattle grew fat on the rich prairie grass. The new room on the cabin was completed, its fresh pine scent filling the air. Alara's courtship with Thomas the blacksmith deepened, and it became clear to everyone that a wedding was in their future. The strange, unlikely family that had formed out of desperation and a lie was putting down roots in the stubborn soil. One evening, as twilight settled over the plains in shades of lavender and rose, Silas and Maeve sat on the porch steps, watching Finn chase fireflies in the growing dark. The boys' laughter was a bright, clean sound in the vast quiet. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply shared the moment, the peace of it settling around them like a comfortable blanket. "I never thought I would hear a child's laughter here again," Silas said, his voice low. He wasn't looking at her, but out at the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to appear. Maeve followed his gaze. "He is happy here," she said softly. "We all are." He finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw the last of the haunted shadows begin to recede. The deep-seated grief was still there. It would always be a part of him, but it was no longer the only thing. It was now joined by something else, something warm and alive. He had built a wall around his heart to keep the pain in, but in doing so, he had also kept the world out. And they, this unexpected family, had somehow managed to find a way through the cracks. They had not healed him, but they had given him a reason to start rebuilding. From silence came warmth. From duty came devotion. The narrative of their lives had been rewritten. The mail-order bride arrangement, a contract of convenience, had dissolved on the dusty street of redemption, replaced by something forged in a blizzard and sealed by a protective lie. The home was no longer just a cabin, but a place of belonging. The family was no longer a man and his intended, but a man, a woman, and a boy who had found each other in the wilderness. The rocker by the fire, once a symbol of profound loss, was now a place where Finn listened to stories, its gentle creak a lullaby of continuity, a bridge between a painful past and a hopeful future. The seasons turned, and the foundations of their new life settled and grew strong. Winter returned to the high plains, but it was a different kind of winter now. It was not a threat to be endured in solitude, but a season for drawing close, for sharing the warmth of the hearth. Snow fell in thick, silent blankets, insulating their small home from the rest of the world, creating a peaceful, self-contained universe. Alara was married now, living in town with Thomas, her life full and happy. But she and her husband visited often, their wagon tracks a recurring line of connection across the white landscape. The family had not shrunk, it had grown. One cold night, the wind moaned outside, but inside the cabin, all was calm. A fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow on the log walls. The child's drawing was still tacked there, its lines now faded and soft. Finn was asleep in the new room, tucked securely in his bed. Silas sat in his usual chair, mending a piece of leather harness, his large hands moving with a slow, familiar skill. The lamp on the table cast a pool of light around him. Maeve finished tidying the kitchen and came to sit in the rocking chair near him. For a time, they sat in their comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind, and the soft scrape of his knife against the leather. The air was filled with a deep, unspoken peace. She looked at him, at the way the firelight carved shadows and highlights onto his weathered face. He was no longer the grim, withdrawn stranger she had met at the depot. He was the man who had faced down a storm to save her son, the man who had built a home with his bare hands, the man who had given them his name when they had nothing. He was Silas. He finished his work, setting the mended harness aside. He leaned back in his chair, a weary but contented sigh escaping him. He looked into the flames, his thoughts his own. Maeve stopped the gentle motion of the rocker. She rose and walked the few steps to his chair. She stood beside him for a moment, then reached down and gently laid her hand over his, the one that rested on the arm of the chair. Her hand was small against his, but it was warm and sure. He did not startle. He simply turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. No words were spoken. None were needed. Everything that had to be said had been said in 1,000 silent gestures over the past year. On a peg by the door, his worn work coat hung, a permanent fixture now, a silent testament to the protection he had offered and the life they had built beneath it. She stayed.